So the shutter's in little pieces and I need to clean everything before I reassemble it. The object of the exercise here is simply to clean these components up. Remove all the old dirt and grease. You have to be very careful here with this spring not to damage it. So you be careful what you're doing with your cotton bud so you don't catch it on that spring and damage it. It can even come adrift if you poke and prod at it in the wrong way, in which case it'll fly across the room like that other spring which I haven't recovered it yet. This piece, the retard gear train. There's a spring here, a coiled spring, like a hairspring on a watch. It's not as delicate as the hairspring on a watch, but that's the shape of it. I always make sure that I've got, hold the pallets out like I'm doing with my thumb, swing this arm outwards, release the pallets, that locks the mechanism. That coil spring's wound up, it means it's wound up, it's out of the way. It's not there where I can easily damage it. And it means I can slide a cotton bud soaked with solvent around the inside there. Of course, as soon as I hit the pallet lever here, the wheel unwinds and drops back into the path. So all of these parts I just want to get nice and clean. This mechanism plate's a problem because it's so oily. I'm going to have to spend a bit of time trying to make sure I get rid of all the oil that'll be hiding on surfaces which I can't readily access. Here I'm just using a bit of cotton on a pair of tweezers. And the underside of the mechanism plate needs to be cleaned likewise. Around the inside edge here, that's where the blade actuating ring runs, around that inside track. And the shutter blades run against the surface at the back where these cutouts are. All of that needs to be oil free. That's pretty good. I'm still left with this retard gear train, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour some naphtha in there and work that mechanism a few times. Pour a bit more in there, work the mechanism again, and you can see the naphtha running out onto the paper below me, but it'll also be carrying with it the oil that it has dissolved. I've got to do this a number of times because there's lots of oil and I want to be sure it's all gone. Now I need to blow that out. The reason I want to blow that solvent out is as I blow the solvent away, it's carrying away the oil with it. If I just left that to dry naturally, the solvent would evaporate and it would leave the oil behind. And I'll be back where I started. So I'm blowing that solvent away. And I'll pour some more in there and I'll do it again. Hold back the pallets, work the mechanism. Blow that solvent away. And because this is such an oily pig of a mechanism, I'm going to pour some naphtha on the whole surface and blow that away. Now naphtha is a fairly mild solvent as these things go, but it works well. I would advise you not to get enthusiastic with anything clever like CRC brake clean or anything of that nature, because you're likely to find if you start squirting it around, it'll lift that paint off the inside lip there at the bottom, and then you'll be having to paint that back afterwards. So naphtha is good. multiple applications are better. Now if I hold back the pallets, you can hear as I swing this backwards and forwards, makes a positive sort of whizzing noise. That tells me that that is free from that oil which was making that run very quietly previously. Well, that's relatively clean now. I'm quite happy with that. I'm just putting some naphtha on a cotton bud and once more just wiping these surfaces to make sure I've got them as clean as I can get them. That should be good, and that mechanism plate is now ready for me to reassemble it. But of course I've got the other components that go with it. The blade actuating ring. This was quite oily. It was clean enough. It wasn't covered in dust or dried grease or anything, but it was quite oily. So I want to get this wiped down, because this of course comes in direct contact with the shutter blades, because these pins drive the shutter blades. And if there was any oil on here, then it would just migrate onto the shutter blades and you wouldn't exactly be back where you started, because we've removed so much oil already, but it certainly wouldn't be advantageous. And the retainer plate, this is very oily. You can see the colour coming off here, that yellow, that's just oil and not an awful lot else. So this will have to be swabbed once or twice. Usually you can tell when you've removed all the oil, because the black surface will be dull. It'll be a dull charcoal grey colour. And when it's saturated in oil, it'll be a nice glossy black. I'm looking at that surface. Now there's some roughness there. I'm not sure whether it's surface corrosion or not. This face, this nice shiny face, that's only goes up against the blade actuating ring. I'm just going to pour some naphtha around that little pallet wheel there and blow that away, because almost certainly there'll be oil underneath that pallet wheel. And of course that's riveted in place, I can't just remove it. That plate looks okay. The only thing I'm vaguely concerned with is the surface of this. You can see by the colour of that there's discoloration, and that discoloration may be roughness of surface. I'm just running my screwdriver tip lightly over that, see how that feels. It doesn't feel rough, but I can see that the screwdriver leaves marks in there. So it's like there's something on that surface. I'm going to get a toothpick and rub away at that with a toothpick. It doesn't feel rough. But there's certainly some discoloration there, and it's worse at this spot here. Yeah, there's some sort of corrosion or oxidization or something of the surface at that point. I think I'll clean this with a little bit of metal polish, just to satisfy myself that those surfaces are smooth. I must say they don't feel rough to me. This is just a piece of hard plastic foam that I've got here to work on, and I'm just using some metal polish, some Brasso, on a cotton bud, and I'm just running over all those surfaces. To take any roughness off and any those oxidised areas will probably clean up quite well. Yeah, I can see the black surface on here, the black plating, whatever it is, the bluing, that's coming away where those rough patches were, so it was a deterioration in that finish. Okay, that looks good. Now of course I've got to clean all that polish away, otherwise I'll be leaving an abrasive in there, and I don't want to be doing that. So I'll clean these surfaces, and the video camera is telling me that it's tired and it wants to sleep, the batteries are flat. So if this stops before I finish doing this task, that'll be why. Well, that's much better, and I'll just rinse that palette wheel once more in case any polish got down inside there, and I think I'll call that done. So that's good. And so that's my mechanism plate basically cleaned up, ready to go. The shutter case, I want to clean this now. Of course this is much simpler. So, cleaning this case. Well, again it's just naphtha, and basically I want to remove all the oil and grease in this case. You can see that's coming off quite dirty. Interesting that both of these cameras shutters that I'm working on here were very oily. It does bring up the possibility that someone added oil. Now typically when that happens it's much more obvious than this. Or it may just be that both cameras were stored somewhere quite warm, where that promoted the oil, the grease in the helicals to thin out, and for their more volatile components to move and find their way into the shutter. Once more, and I'll have this as clean as I need it to be. There are still some marks inside the case down in here, but they are mild corrosion marks in the case, just oxidisation of that aluminium surface, and they've nothing of significance. and very small. But I seem to have that nice and clean. That all looks good to me. So the case is done. The retainer plate here, that surface is not too bad. You can see marks coming off on this. Some of that will be oil and some of it may just be corrosion products from the surface. These plates are chemically blackened brass, I think, and whatever that process is, probably that coating or may come away. Oh, that's coming off. It's coming away quite cleanly now, so whatever was loose on that surface cleaned off with the first round. Let's see if I can get this surface clean. I'm looking at this plate, it's not exactly dead smooth. That surface shows quite a pronounced grain to it. I don't know whether that shows up here, but there's quite a pronounced grain. So that was not a polished sheet to begin with. That's good. You can certainly see shadows here, like the ghost marks of the blades where they've sat over time. And what happens, I think, is that the oil and things that's trapped in at those points, basically some of that will be the remains of that oil. It will penetrate it into the surface and it's there as a stain. And oils, as they deteriorate over time, they will leave like a lacquer behind, which won't dissolve. You can use any solvent you like, it just doesn't want to go away. But you'll often get that happen too, so there might be an element of that. But that's good. All the oil's gone from there, so that's as clean as we need it to be. And I'm just left here with the moving plate. This is the piece that's moved by the blade actuating, by the aperture setting lever at the back of the camera. Again, this isn't too bad. This surface is typically more shiny than the other surface. There are a few marks on here. You can probably see, if I can get it right in the light. You can probably see a mark right here. That's a fingerprint. And basically it means that at some stage when this was clean and free from oil, somebody picked it up between finger and thumb and left their fingerprints behind. And that's because the skin oils and perspiration, the salts in the perspiration, are left behind and they will etch their way into metal surfaces quite well. And yeah, it's quite definite fingerprint round here and to a lesser extent on the other side. And yes, on the opposite side where that big fingerprint is there, it's the same deal there. So handle these pieces by the edges, otherwise somebody will be able to track you down in the future from your fingerprints and know who did it. Okay, well those parts are quite good. What's this? This is the settings lever from the back of the shutter, and this was quite greasy. I'll clean this. This is obviously of lesser importance because it's on the outside of the shutter, but we want this to move smoothly. They're not absolutely free because you don't want the aperture settings to be easily bumped, because it's an easy thing to overlook, and then of course you end up with exposures that are anything but what you expected. Right, that's good. Now the blades need to be done next. Well, these shutter blades are very oily. I can't tell immediately until I have a go at cleaning them whether all the marks on the surface are simply oil and will clean away, or whether there's some roughness or corrosion that might need to be polished away. So I'll clean one blade first and see what sort of result I get. You can tell by the feel of the cotton bud as it runs across the surface whether it's smooth or whether it's slightly rough. That feels fine to me, and it looks okay. So it looks to me like that blade was just oily. And I'll pick one of these as a comparison. See if I can get that held in the light. So here's the clean blade. You can see that that's even in colour, comparatively light coloured and comparatively dull. Here's the uncleaned blade, and you can see that it's uneven. There's obviously marks on there, and it looks darker in tone, and that'll be because of the oil. So I'm just going to clean that one too with some naphtha and just work my way through each of these 5 blades in turn, making sure I clean both surfaces. And typically you have to go over them once or twice, and I'm checking them. I've got window light coming in from my right here, so I can judge from the reflected window light on those surfaces how clean they are. It's much easier than trying to judge them looking straight ahead at them. That's just about impossible. But with reflected light you can get a very good impression of how clean they're getting. So I'll do these other 3 blades, and then that'll be that task out the way. Okay, so the diaphragm blades, of course there are 10 diaphragm blades here to be dealt with. The diaphragm blades are fairly fragile, so you have to be careful with them. It's finding the favourite pair of tweezers to deal with these. The diaphragm blades have a rivet on each end, one on one surface, one facing the other way. They're not symmetrical. One's closer to the edge of the blade, one's closer to the centre of the blade, which is important when you go to put them back in the diaphragm and assemble it. But those pivots, the oil tends to seep underneath them, and it's hard to get it all away perfectly. You just do the best job you can. There's a limit to how much you can achieve. And I'm looking at the state of this blade, and I'm watching with reflected light in the window. The surface is not incredibly polished and smooth. There's like a patch in the middle there, probably where the blades overlapped, where it looks a little bit rough. And there's certainly a patch here too. I'm just checking that those marks are permanent, that they don't clean off. They don't. That's okay. That means that's as clean as I'm going to get that blade. That's just the first one of the series. It looks relatively flat. I think that'll be okay. So I'll clean all these blades in sequence, and I'll lay them all out the same way, so that when I pick them up, this one's very oily. You can see the oil on that one. And you can probably tell that that's quite dark compared to its mate, and that's just the saturated oil in the surface. So I'll clean all these 10 blades, and as I say, you need to be very careful. They're quite delicate, they're easily bent up, so I'm holding this down with a pair of tweezers here, but I'm just using very light pressure, not hardly pressing down on it at all, just keeping it down on the surface, because I do not want to bend those blades. If they get bent, they are very difficult to get to lie flat, and if they don't lie flat, reassembling the diaphragm becomes a major challenge. I mean, it's not good on a good day, but you don't want anything going against you. Alright, so that blade looks good. So that's 2 blades of the 10. I've got to work my way through all of these now. get them clean, oil free. Those ones are stuck together, and then I can start reassembling things. You don't need to watch me clean these last 8 blades, you've already seen it done. I've cleaned all the blades, now I'm just cleaning the screws. Normally you don't need to bother with something like this, but where the shutter's been very oily, it's always worth doing the screws as well. And you can see I'm just using a cotton bud soaked in naphtha. I'm just pushing these lightly around on the piece of paper. Be very careful because of course screws are small and they'll want to fly off into the distance given the opportunity. So I'll pop all those screws to one side because now I'm ready to start reassembling things. Well, I always start here with the diaphragm, and I'll start with the retainer plate. There's 2 sides to the retainer plate obviously. One side has got 5 slight indentations in it, that goes down on my jig. Plain side is up. And I'll bring my blades forward where I can get to them easily and start putting them in place. Now I've got my blades all laid out the same way here. The rivet closest to the centre line of the blade goes downwards into the plate here, and I can just lay these all in place in sequence. I'm using a toothpick to help me position the blade, and everything goes very easily until you get to the last few blades, because of course the holes in the plate are covered up, and so you have to swing the blades out in order to access them. So we get 6 blades in easily. Number 5, that blade is not lying dead flat, that's going to cause me problems. Right, now I've got to start pulling these first blades back away so I can get to the hole that it's been hidden there. That's blade number 7. Looking at these blades I can tell that they're not dead flat. They're slightly distorted around the pivot point there, and that is almost certainly because of the oil. To be very cautious doing this because it's easy to bump the thing and to have your blades all pop out of place, and then you've got to start the process all over again. And you can get very tired of doing that. That's the last hole exposed, and here's the last blade. Now that is not wanting to sit dead flat. Now I've got to lift these blades back over the top of that last blade without disturbing anything. And swing them back into position. If everything goes smoothly, nothing will have been disturbed and everything will be correctly positioned with its pivot in place. In practice it doesn't always go that way. Now I'm going to lay this plate on. Now you can see here there are 2 location holes fairly close together. Well, the one at this end, I need to lie this plate on here so that the slot here closest to that one drops onto a pin and get it seated over the top of all of those pins, those rivets. If I wriggle it about a bit and poke at the blades, they should drop into position. That's pretty good, but on this side I can see a couple are not in line yet. So I'll see if I can pull those into line. Okay, so there I've got the plate in place. You can see the two screw holes here and here in the black plate, and the hole here in the brass. Now I've got to get my case over the top of that, and those two screw holes in the black plate here and here have to line up with these screw holes here and here. So I'm just going to lower this into position. Give it a bit of a wriggle to centre it. Flip this over holding it firmly. Lift the outer part of my jig away, slide it underneath to support that. And now I've got to get my three fixing screws in place. Now the three fixing screws, one of them is a countersunk head screw, and one of these positions has a slight countersink in it, ready to take that screw. So I'll get that screw started. Just do it up very lightly. The other two screws are plain. I'll get those in position. Whoops, that one's trying to fall out somewhere else. Once I've got these three screws lightly screwed down, I'll check to make sure that all my blades are still correctly positioned. Never just go crazy and tighten up all the screws first, because you'll end up damaging something if something's incorrectly positioned. And very frequently something is incorrectly positioned. Right, so that's good. Now what I'm looking for is to make sure that the pivots are all present and correctly placed in that plate, that nothing looks out of place. That all looks good. So I'll just continue doing those screws up lightly, not tightening them. I'm just taking the slack out of it. It all looks good. Now I can flip this over and see if those blades move smoothly. And they do. They're all in place, they're all moving smoothly. That's all running nicely. And now I can tighten those three screws. And you can see I got about an eighth of a turn, something like that. Slightly less on that one. That's done. That diaphragm is all correctly assembled. The blades look good. We know they're not oily because I've cleaned them all. There are certainly marks on them. Some of those will be corrosion, some of it's scuff marks where the blades run over each other, but they're not affecting the way it works. And it's a very dangerous thing trying to polish diaphragm blades to remove their marks because they're so delicate. It's because of the little rivets on them. It's very easy to catch those rivets with whatever you're using to polish the blades and end up bending the blade. So you don't need to do any more than that. That's all that's required. So that I can put aside and get back to assembling the mechanism plate.